Okay, so right off the top, you see the headline there, Jack Smith subpoenaed. We're following some breaking news for you at this very hour. The House Judiciary Committee has subpoenaed former special counsel Jack Smith to testify at a deposition December 17th. Representative Jim Jordan issued that subpoena in this letter. So we're talking about what's in it and why. Let's bring in CBS News Justice reporter Jake Rosen, who is following the very latest from Washington. Jake, a lot of people wondered if President Donald Trump wouldn't go after his adversaries. Does this move sort of underscore that that's what's at foot here?
Oh, certainly. And we saw at yesterday's cabinet meeting, Reed, that Attorney General Pam Bondi said that she was still open to potentially exploring potential investigations and potential indictments if it came to that point about Jack Smith's investigations into President Trump for both his special counsel investigations into President Trump's alleged mishandling of classified documents, but also his alleged plot to interfere with the 2020 election results. There's been a couple separate efforts and threads here that are all really intertwining. Jack Smith came out publicly in October, Reed, and said that he was willing to go testify publicly in front of both the House and Senate Judiciary Committees to explain, quote, according to his attorney, clarify the various misconceptions about his investigations. This really has not satisfied Senate and House Republicans. They want something to be done behind doors. What it appears right now is that on December 17th, Jack Smith will cooperate and come in. You see the statement from his attorney, Peter Koski, there. He's going to come in and meet with these investigators and lawmakers who potentially have a range of questions. Some of them are not necessarily related to what the current circumstance is in the House and Senate, which is some new revelations brought by Senate Chairman of that committee, Chuck Grassley, who said and accused Jack Smith of potentially spying on phone records of certain lawmakers who were involved in Jack Smith's investigation and who Jack Smith investigated. Jack Smith said that those are just misconceptions, and generally that he was just looking at phone records around January 6th or 2021, and that there was no broad wiretapping. It was simply just seeing who had been called when by potentially people at the White House. At the same time, Jim Jordan has been one of those lawmakers who's wanted a full push and brief from Jack Smith on alleged weaponization of the Department of Justice, on who had potentially directed Jack Smith to investigate President Trump on both of these fronts, who had signed off on all the search warrants. Mainly think about President Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate when the FBI raided that. So there are so many different threads, and we've heard from Jack Smith and his legal team all along, Reed, that really they are looking forward to this moment. However, it appears it will be behind closed doors.
All right, Jake Rosen, thank you so much for your reporting. Much more to come on this big headline and breaking news for sure.
Listen, between YouTube and Facebook, people are clearly agitated and they're all over the map because so much is going on that just comes across as bonkers. It is bonkers and it's going to get worse. So before I get into the specific questions you asked today, I want to step back and give you a framework for thinking about the moment we're in. All right, and I'm going to take you way back. I'm going to take you all the way back to 1935, because in 1935, something dramatic happened to the United States government, and that was under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, during the Great Depression, Congress passed and the president signed into law the Social Security Act. And what that did is it changed the relationship between individuals and the government. That is, the government took on a responsibility for making sure that the elderly and children and differently abled people and so on had some support. And what that did is it really reoriented the government in a pretty dramatic way. That is, the elderly suddenly didn't necessarily have to worry about being on the street, or, this actually came from somebody watching two elderly ladies eating out of a trash can. And, if they still lived with their children, they would bring a paycheck, or a Social Security check into their families. So it reoriented the country in a fairly dramatic way. But some other things also happened under the New Deal. One of those was the idea that the government would try to treat everybody in America, all the men in America similarly, and there were also gains for women as well. Now, that didn't actually happen. Certainly Black Americans and Brown Americans, and certainly Indigenous Americans, were not treated the same as white men. But there was this devotion to that idea that that America's laws would once be colorblind the way they had been designed to be after the Civil War. So you got that, but you also got the federal government beginning to invest in in infrastructure, for example, in the Tennessee Valley Authority, in making sure that people had electricity, in making sure that people had access to decent roads. Now, that's going to take off after World War II. But what I'm trying to lay out here is the idea that government starts to be involved in the American society in a different way than it had been before. And it also, quite crucially, begins to regulate business. It begins to step in and say to business people, hey, you can't do anything you want. You can't do things like, for example, put your workers on a bus and drive them into the middle of the desert and push them off and make them make their way back to a town without any water to prove to them that they better do as you say. That actually happened in Arizona. So that mattered a lot. But what it also did is it was enormously popular. People really liked this government. It stabilized the country. It stabilized the economy, gave people a sense that they could work their way up. And the country, especially after World War II, when the United States is one of the few countries that hasn't been completely destroyed by that war, so the economy booms, it really convinces people that this is the kind of government we need. And it's called the liberal consensus. Liberal meaning the idea that in order for individuals to be able to have the opportunity to create their own futures, you need to have a government that makes sure they're not going to get squished by big business or by starvation, that they get educations, that they have access to health care, that there is a way to protect the individual, the libre, the individual person in a society. So there is this sense that this is the way America is going to be. And Americans since then, of all political parties, for an overwhelming majority of them, have liked that system. Now, they don't agree about what the laws should all look like or how much infrastructure there should be and so on. But they did agree that they liked that kind of a government. And many of them thought it wouldn't go anywhere, that this was here to stay. So when Democrats used to say, well, the Republicans are trying to take away Social Security, there was a lot of people saying, oh, that's just ridiculous. You're fear mongering. They'll never do that, right? Okay, so what happens is that beginning in the 1930s, but really taking off in the 1950s, you have a group largely made up of wealthy businessmen, because entrepreneurs like that system. They like that level playing field. But more established businessmen don't like it, because they don't like the idea either of business regulation. That's what they really don't like. And they don't like the idea of the taxation that is required to do things like pay for roads and schools and hospitals. So they begin to argue that this system is a form of socialism. Remember, you've got the real fear after World War II of communism spreading across Asia and across from the USSR, from the Soviet Union. But they argue partly that it's socialism. They also make a big stand against the idea that it is being caused, this large government that provides these benefits for all Americans, is coddling Black people, brown people, and women. And that really takes off after it takes off a little bit before that. It takes off as early as 1948 under President Truman, because he begins to desegregate the military, for example, and he puts together this committee of people to talk about how civil rights really matter in America. But it really takes off after 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, in which those people who object to business regulation and object to the idea of the taxes that do things like underpin a social safety net and infrastructure, that they don't want to pay those taxes. And they start to argue then that the whole point of there being this government that does all these things, is to funnel the tax dollars of hardworking Americans, defined usually as white men in the literature of the time, to undeserving people of color, Black Americans. Women are going to come in the late 1960s, 1970s. That idea that the government that is serving everybody is a reflection of the demands of undeserving, sort of un-American-ish people of color, and as I say later, women, really takes off after 1965 with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which guarantees that people of color can vote And that law is going to get expanded later on with the demand that we provide ballots in a number of different languages, for example. Then in the 1960s and then into the 1970s, under Richard Nixon, those people who are objecting to that government for different reasons, and mind you, this is a drive-by of American history. I mean, I should stop and give you 10 hours on basically each sentence here. But there is the argument beginning in 1971, 72, before Roe versus Wade, that women who want to work outside the home, known as women's libbers by those people who don't like them, are trying to destroy the American family and trying to insist on benefits from the federal government to give them benefits that they don't deserve, and that they want to use benefits for things like abortion. And this is where abortion starts to become a really big rallying cry for that reactionary right-wing movement, because it begins to pull into that Republican coalition that stands against business regulation religious traditionalists who really begin to talk about abortion not as having anything to do with fetuses, but rather with freeing women from traditional marriages and from traditional hierarchies. And that's going to be really key, because going into the 1970s, then you're going to see a re-emphasis or an emphasis on traditional hierarchies of race and hierarchies of gender, getting linked together to this idea of getting rid of that government that regulates business, provides a basic social safety net, promotes infrastructure, and protects civil rights, and also works in the international level to create all these alliances. I won't talk more about that today.